The rain's already started. Let me tell you a story, no rush, no noise, just a calm place to rest your thoughts. But before we start, make sure you hit that subscribe button. By the way, what time is it where you are right now? The man who walked his dog at the same time every night. There are certain people you don't really meet, you just start noticing them. You never speak, never even nod sometimes, but they become part of your world, like the soft hum of a refrigerator or the creak of a step you've walked over too many times to count. For me, it was the man with the dog. He passed by my building almost every night, 9:17 p.m., give or take a minute. I started paying attention to the exact time, not because I meant to, but because my kettle would start to hiss around then, and I'd be in the kitchen window watching the steam rise when they walked past. Him in his dark coat, hood up even when it wasn't raining, and the dog, a golden retriever, older, slow in the way that makes you feel tender, even if you've never owned a dog. There was nothing remarkable about it. He didn't have a limp or a noticeable hat or a strange gait. Just a man and his dog, walking the same stretch of sidewalk every night, like they had nowhere urgent to be but nowhere better to go. Sometimes I'd see them pause at the corner, the man looking down while the dog sniffed at the same patch of grass as the night before. And I don't know when it happened exactly, but I started to look forward to that moment, to that quiet, to the way they reminded me that life was still happening, even in the dullest hours of the day. I imagined he lived nearby, that maybe he always had someone who liked his routines, someone who didn't need to be noticed to feel real. And maybe I was projecting, but there was something comforting in the way they always came back, that they were always on time, like a soft clock I didn't know I'd started depending on. I never told anyone about them. Why would I? It was nothing, just a man walking his dog at the same time every night. But in the quiet of those evenings, when the TV was off and the tea steeped and the sky dimmed into that slate blue hush, they were there, small, consistent, and kind without asking to be. And somehow, without ever saying a word, they became part of how I measured time. I don't think I would have noticed the time if it hadn't been for the kettle. The familiar whistle filled the kitchen, same as every evening, and I turned toward the window automatically, not even thinking about it, just letting my eyes drift to that stretch of sidewalk beyond the hedge, but the space was empty. At first, I didn't register it. I stirred the tea, waited a little, telling myself maybe I was early tonight, or maybe he'd paused at the corner, tying a shoe, or waiting for the dog to finish with some stubborn patch of grass. But the clock on the stove read 9:22, and the street stayed still. I watched a little longer. A few cars rolled past headlights, briefly lighting up the brick wall across the street, but no man, no dog. I went and sat down, trying not to overthink it. I told myself it was nothing. People skip nights. Maybe it was raining earlier somewhere else in town. Maybe the dog had a sore paw, or the man had dinner plans, or they'd gone for a walk earlier while the sun was still out. It didn't have to mean anything. But still, something in me felt off, like a thread had gone loose in the middle of a sweater I'd worn every day without realizing how much I relied on it. The next night, I was at the window again by instinct. Kettle, mug, steam curling quietly. 9:17. Then 9:18. Still nothing. And that time, I felt it more sharply. Not panic, not anything dramatic, just a strange kind of ache. I hadn't known how much I'd come to expect them, how much comfort I'd found in their quiet presence. It wasn't like I knew him. I didn't know his name or where he lived or what he did in the hours outside our brief overlap, but I'd noticed him. I'd made space for him in my evenings. And now, with nothing but the sound of my own kettle and the too still street below, it felt like something had gently slipped out of place. It wasn't a loss, not exactly, just the feeling of someone whose absence reminded you how much their presence had meant, even if neither of you ever said a word. After the third evening without them, something shifted not outside, not in the world, but in me. I still made the tea, still stood by the window around the same time, but now it wasn't routine. Now it was waiting. And even though I told myself not to be dramatic, not to project stories onto strangers, I started scanning the street more slowly, letting my eyes rest on things I used to pass over. A dog leash draped on a fence post, a porch light left on too early in the day, the silhouette of someone behind the curtain across the street. Nothing was different. Really, the neighborhood moved as it always had, but now there was a new kind of silence in the space where they used to be. I walked the opposite direction the next morning just to stretch my legs, I told myself. But I noticed my steps wandering the route I'd imagined they must have taken each night. Around the corner, past the bakery, down by the mailbox where the pavement always cracked. I didn't see them. I didn't see anyone who looked like someone I could ask. And even if I had, what would I say? Hi. Did the man with the golden retriever disappear? There wasn't anything to explain. No reason for concern. Just a quiet presence that had stopped appearing. Still, I began noticing signs of them, or maybe I was just hoping to. Once, I saw paw prints in the dust by the construction site near the end of the street. Another time, an empty coffee cup on the bench I imagined he'd sometimes stop to rest on. They meant nothing. But in the stillness that followed their absence, even nothing started to feel like something. And more than anything, I began to realize how much space someone could take up in your life without ever entering it. No conversations, no shared glances, not even a name. Just their rhythm, their existence, quietly brushing against yours each evening like a passing breeze, and then, suddenly, gone. And it made me think of all the people we see and never know, who we share the same sidewalks and grocery lines and bus stops with, whose stories run parallel to ours, never touching but always there, and how maybe the only thing lonelier than missing someone you love is noticing too late that you'd started to care about someone you never got the chance to know. It had been nearly 2 weeks since I'd last seen them long enough for the rhythm to fade, for my body to stop checking the window quite so instinctively, though I still found myself lingering there some nights, tea in hand, gaze unfocused, more out of habit than hope. The sidewalk stayed quiet. The corner patch of grass where the dog always paused had grown a little wild, untamed now, without those nightly footsteps keeping it pressed down. I'd started to let go of the expectation. Life moves like that, routines slip away, people vanish from the periphery of your days, and all you're left with is the trace they left behind. But then, one afternoon, not evening, not anywhere near their usual hour, I took a different route home from the post office, cutting across the little park 2 blocks over, the one with the crooked bench and the old stone fountain that never quite worked. And there, beneath one of the maple trees just off the path, was the golden retriever. I knew it instantly, not because of anything specific, but in the same way you'd recognize someone by the feeling they gave you. He was lying down, head resting between his front paws, eyes half closed in that peaceful, half-aware state dogs seemed to master better than people ever could. Next to him, on the bench, sat a woman I didn't recognize, older gray sweater, hands folded quietly in her lap. She wasn't on her phone, she wasn't reading, she was just sitting, present. And for a moment, I stood frozen in the stillness of it, afraid to interrupt whatever small world I'd just stepped into. I didn't approach, I didn't speak, but the dog lifted his head slowly and looked at me, not excited, not startled, just gently, as if he remembered something too. I gave him a nod, one hand barely lifting in acknowledgement, and he rested his head again like that was enough. I walked home with a strange kind of quiet filling me. It wasn't joy, not exactly, and it wasn't sadness either. It was more like relief, like realizing that something hadn't ended, just changed. Maybe the man was gone, maybe he wasn't, but the dog was still here, still walking these streets, still lying in the shade. And somehow, that felt like enough. Like the story hadn't disappeared, it had simply moved to a different page. After that afternoon in the park, I started to see him more often, the dog. I mean, not every day, not in any routine I could map, but often enough that I began to carry a kind of watchfulness with me, soft and patient, like the way you look out a window during a light snowfall, not expecting anything, just open to the way the world might soften. Sometimes he'd be in the park again, near the bench, sometimes farther off, sniffing at leaves or lying in the shade near the old fountain with the same calm presence as before. The woman I began to think of her as his new companion was always near, always quiet, like she understood that the dog wasn't something to be managed, but someone who moved through the world with memory tucked into his bones. I never approached them, not really, but our eyes met more than once. Her glance wasn't curious or guarded, more like a nod between people who share something unnamed. Once, I brought an apple with me and sat on a bench nearby, not close enough to be intrusive, just enough to feel nearby. The dog raised his head, tail tapping faintly once against the ground, then settled again, and I felt that same flicker in my chest recognition. Not of me specifically, maybe, but of a rhythm, of a face seen before during quieter days. And it struck me, sitting there in the warmth of the fading afternoon, how much of life is made of these unnoticed ties. How someone you never spoke to could carve out a space in your routine so gently you wouldn't realize it until they were gone. And how, even after they're gone, something of them lingers in the sound of paws on pavement, in the corner of a street where the leash always slowed, in the eyes of a dog who once waited for someone to catch up. We talk so much about closure, as if every story needs an ending. But sitting there with a quiet apple in my hand and the sound of birds overhead, I didn't want closure. I wanted continuation. I wanted to believe that presence could live beyond absence, and somehow, in that small, still space between strangers, I think I did. It happened on a Wednesday, one of those breezy, overcast afternoons where the clouds hang just low enough to feel like they're leaning in to listen. I hadn't gone to the park with intention, just a need to stretch my legs and clear my head. That quiet tug that pulls you toward familiar places when your thoughts are moving too fast. The air was cool enough to keep most people indoors, and the usual sounds of the neighborhood kids on bikes, lawnmowers in the distance, felt muffled by the sky. I passed the old fountain and followed the curve of the path toward the bench, the one where the woman and the dog had become a kind of fixture now, not daily, but often enough that I'd come to look for them without meaning to. But this time the bench was empty, the space around it still and soft, as if the world had exhaled, and resting right at the edge of the wooden seat, placed so deliberately it made me pause, was something small, a collar, worn leather, a little frayed near the buckle, and attached to it a simple brass tag in the shape of a bone. I didn't need to touch it to know. I recognized the color, that warm, faded tan, the softness of it, shaped by years of wear, and I knew, without needing anyone to say it out loud, the dog was gone. I stood there for a while, not moving, just breathing in that heavy kind of silence that doesn't rush to fill itself with meaning. The collar wasn't a message. It wasn't a dramatic symbol. It was just a presence left behind, a quiet acknowledgement of what had been shared, not only between them, but between all of us who had watched, unknowingly, from the edges of our own lives. And in that moment, I felt something settle inside me. Not grief, exactly, though there was sadness. It was softer than that, a kind of gratitude, maybe, that I had noticed them, that I had witnessed something small and steady, that I had cared even from a distance. I didn't take the collar. I left it there, where it belonged, letting it catch the wind and the memory of pause on pavement. And as I walked home, I didn't look back. I didn't need to. Some stories don't end with explanations. They end with a bench and an empty space and something left behind to remind you this mattered. In the weeks that followed, I found myself moving through the neighborhood with a softer kind of attention. Not searching, not waiting, just noticing, the way you do after something familiar disappears and the world doesn't quite look the same anymore. It wasn't grief, not in the usual sense. I hadn't lost someone I knew, not really. But I had lost a rhythm, a pair of footsteps, the warm flicker of a golden coat under the streetlight. And in their absence, something had opened up in me, a space maybe, or a gentleness I hadn't known I was capable of. I started walking earlier in the day, letting the light change the way the streets looked. I sat longer on park benches. I waved more often to strangers, even if they didn't wave back. And when I saw someone walking a dog, any dog, really I felt a kind of ache that didn't hurt, just a quiet tug, like a reminder that connection doesn't have to be loud or long to leave something behind. Sometimes I'd pass the bench and see a small flower placed near the corner wildflowers, once tucked into the slat where the collar had been, and I didn't know if someone else had left them or if it was just coincidence, but I like to think it was someone who noticed too, someone who'd also looked up at 9, 17 each night and felt the world grow a little steadier because of a man and his dog. I didn't need to know the full story. I didn't need answers or names or reasons. What stayed with me wasn't a narrative, it was a feeling of being near something gentle, of witnessing something real. And slowly, without trying, I began to bring that same quiet care into the rest of my life. I walked slower, I listened longer, I gave myself more permission to just be. And it made me wonder how many other unnoticed patterns I was part of, how many people had seen me pass by without my ever knowing, how many lives we drift through without realizing we've left a mark, and how sometimes the softest presence, a nod, a walk, a leash gently held, can be the most lasting kind of companionship. There are still nights when I look at the clock at 9:17 and wonder, for just a flicker of a moment, if I might see them again, the man and his dog, rounding the corner as if time had paused just long enough to let one more walk pass through. I don't expect it anymore. I don't need it. But the memory is there, folded neatly into the way I live now, like a pressed leaf inside the pages of a book, not obvious, but always there if you know where to look. I've come to realize that most of what shapes us doesn't arrive loudly. It comes in glances, in footsteps, in a dog's slow wag as he pauses at the same patch of grass each evening. It comes in the way we notice or fail to notice, and how sometimes, when we do pay attention, really pay attention, something opens in us that makes room for more. Not more noise, not more answers, just more presence, more space for gentleness, for the kind of quiet that feels like safety. I don't know what happened to the man. I don't know if he moved away or fell ill or simply changed his path one day and never came back to mine. I don't know the dog's name or the woman's, or whether the collar left on the bench was meant for anyone at all. But I do know this: they mattered. Not because of who they were or what they did, but because they were seen, because their consistency, their quiet, wordless return created something grounding in a world that so often forgets how to be still. And maybe that's the truth I carry with me now, that even when people vanish from our lives, even when the routine ends, the part of us they touched doesn't vanish. It lingers. It walks with us. And it's okay to miss them. It's okay to remember without needing closure. Some presences don't ask to stay forever. They ask only to be noticed while they're here. And if we're lucky, we do. And that noticing becomes a part of who we are. Quiet, lasting, and enough.